Picture this. A newborn foal is born on a farm in the early hours of the morning, and within 60 minutes, it's standing. Wobbly, uncertain, but standing. Within a few hours, it's walking beside its mother. Within a day, it can run well enough to escape a predator if it had to. Now picture a human baby born in that same hour. It can't lift its own head. It can't focus its eyes past about 8 inches. It can't regulate its own body temperature. It can't hold up its own neck for months. If you left it alone on the ground the way a fawn or a foal could theoretically survive for a few minutes, it would die. And not eventually, quickly. And here's the part that should bother you more than it probably does. Humans aren't unusually fragile animals. We're apex predators with the most sophisticated brains on the planet. So why does the smartest species in the history of Earth produce offspring that are, by any objective measure, the most helpless babies among all mammals of comparable size? The answer isn't an accident, and it isn't a design flaw. It's the result of a brutal evolutionary trade-off that's been quietly shaping human bodies, human relationships, and human societies for roughly 2 million years. And almost nobody thinks about it while they're doing the thing that actually causes it every single day. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are where this gets uncomfortable. A newborn chimpanzee, our closest living relative, arrives with a brain that's already about 40% of its adult size. A newborn human arrives with a brain that's about 25% of its adult size. That gap might not sound like much until you realize what it actually means. If a human baby were born at the same relative brain development as a chimpanzee, human pregnancy wouldn't last 9 months. It would last somewhere around 18 to 21 months, nearly 2 years inside the womb. That number comes from a calculation researchers sometimes call the fetalization gap. And it's been discussed in evolutionary biology since at least the 1970s, when Swiss anatomist Adolf Portman first proposed that humans are functionally born about a year too early compared to other primates. Portman called human infants secondarily altricial, meaning we're technically born helpless, but not because our ancestors were always helpless like mice or birds. We became helpless. Something forced our babies out of the womb early, and that something has a name. It's called the obstetric dilemma, and it's essentially a war between two different evolutionary pressures happening inside the same body. On one side, natural selection kept favoring bigger brains in early humans, because bigger brains meant better tool use, better social coordination, better problem solving, better survival. On the other side, natural selection also favored an upright bipedal walking posture because walking on 2 legs freed up the hands, improved long-distance endurance, and let early humans travel further to find food and water. Those two adaptations sound unrelated until you consider what bipedalism does to the pelvis. Walking upright requires a narrower, more compact pelvis to support the body's weight efficiently, but a narrower pelvis means a narrower birth canal. And a narrower birth canal puts a hard physical ceiling on how large a baby's head can get before delivery becomes lethal for both mother and child. For roughly 2 million years, these two forces have been locked in a tug of war. Brains kept trying to get bigger. Pelvises couldn't get much wider without ruining our ability to walk and run efficiently. Something had to give, and what gave was the baby's timeline. Evolution essentially solved an unsolvable engineering problem by kicking the baby out the door before the renovation was finished. Anthropologists Karen Rosenberg and Wenda Trevathan have spent decades studying this exact bottleneck, and their research suggests human childbirth became dangerous enough, specifically because of this brain-pelvis conflict, that it likely changed human social behavior itself. Difficult births probably pushed early human females towards seeking assistance from other individuals during labor, which may be one of the earliest roots of cooperative, socially supported childbirth in any primate species. In other words, the size of your skull as an infant may have quietly shaped how human beings started helping each other thousands of generations before anyone wrote anything down. But the obstetric dilemma only explains part of the story, and honestly, it's the part most documentaries stop at. The more interesting layer is what happens after birth, because a human baby doesn't just arrive early. It arrives into what researchers sometimes call the 4th trimester. an unofficial but widely used term describing the first roughly 3 months of a newborn's life, during which the infant is still essentially finishing gestational development, just outside the womb instead of inside it. During this window, a human infant can't crawl, can't cling to a caregiver's body the way an infant chimpanzee or gorilla instinctively grips its mother's fur, can't regulate body temperature without help, and can't produce more than a fraction of the antibodies needed to fight off infection on its own. Compare that to a newborn gorilla, which within days can cling tightly enough to its mother's chest hair to be carried through trees while she forages. Human infants lost that grip reflex's usefulness almost entirely, mostly because we lost the body hair that made it functional in the first place. So evolution left us with an infant that instinctively tries to grasp. The reflex is still there if you put a finger in a newborn's palm, but with nothing left to actually hold on to. This is where the story gets genuinely strange, because it means human infants are, in a very real sense, incomplete organisms at birth in a way that almost no other mammal experiences to this degree. And that incompleteness isn't a flaw in the system, it's the entire point of the system. Because a baby born this helpless requires something that almost no other species on the planet requires at this scale: near constant, intensive, multi-person caregiving for years. Not months, years. And that single requirement appears to have rewired an enormous portion of human social structure to accommodate it. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy has spent much of her career studying exactly this idea, and her research points to something that upends the traditional assumption that human child rearing was always primarily a two-parent or even a mother-only operation. Hrdy's work on what's called cooperative breeding suggests that human infants, precisely because they're born so catastrophically underdeveloped, essentially forced early human groups to evolve a support network of caregivers beyond just the biological mother. Grandmothers, older siblings, aunts, and unrelated group members who took on what researchers call alloparenting, caregiving from individuals who aren't the biological parent. This isn't common among great apes. Chimpanzee and gorilla mothers are almost fiercely possessive of their infants and rarely allow others to hold or care for them in the first weeks of life. Human mothers, across an enormous range of cultures and historical periods, routinely hand infants to other caregivers within days of birth. That's not a cultural quirk. Hrdy's argument is that it's a biological necessity baked directly into how helpless our species is forced to be at birth. We didn't become a cooperative species by choice. We became one because a baby this fragile is functionally impossible for one person to raise alone. Let's widen the comparison for a second, because seeing human helplessness next to other species makes the scale of it almost absurd. A newborn wildebeest calf can outrun a hyena within about 6 minutes of being born. A newborn kangaroo, admittedly still tiny and underdeveloped by marsupial standards, can already crawl unaided into its mother's pouch using nothing but smell and instinct. Even other primates put human infants to shame. A baby baboon rides on its mother's back within its first week, gripping fur with functional strength. A baby orangutan can support its own body weight hanging from a branch before it's a month old. Human infants, meanwhile, spend that same first month essentially doing 3 things: eating, sleeping, and crying, none of which require voluntary muscle control, coordinated movement, or independent thermoregulation. If you ranked every mammal on Earth by a simple scale of newborn self-sufficiency, humans would sit near the very bottom, comfortably below species a fraction of our size and a fraction of our intelligence. That ranking should feel backwards. It isn't. It's the direct, unavoidable output of the trade-off we just walked through. There's also a detail about human pregnancy itself that most people never connect to any of this. Human gestation lasts about 40 weeks, roughly the same as many other primates relative to body size. But what's actually happening during that window looks different once you examine it closely. For roughly the first 2 trimesters, a human fetus's brain development tracks reasonably close to what you'd expect for a primate our size. Then, starting in the 3rd trimester, something unusual happens. Brain growth accelerates dramatically, adding cortical volume at a rate that, if it continued unchecked for even a few more months, would produce a head too large to pass through the pelvis at all. Radiologic studies of maternal pelvic dimensions versus fetal head growth curves show the 2 lines converging toward a genuinely narrow window, sometimes described informally among obstetricians as a matter of centimeters, not inches, separating a survivable delivery from an obstructed one. Birth, in this light, isn't simply the end of gestation. It's an emergency exit, triggered right around the point where staying any longer becomes more dangerous than leaving unfinished. There's a phrase researchers sometimes use for this entire situation: neurological unfinishedness. And it's worth sitting with that phrase for a second, because it reframes everything about what a human baby actually is. A newborn foal's brain is essentially wired for the environment it's about to walk into. A newborn human's brain is deliberately, evolutionarily unwired, left open, plastic, unfinished, so that an enormous amount of its final architecture can be shaped by the specific environment, language, culture, and relationships it happens to be born into. If a human baby were born with a chimpanzee level of neurological completion, its brain would essentially already be set. Instead, roughly 75% of human brain growth happens after birth, much of it wiring itself in direct response to sensory input, social interaction, touch, sound, and repeated caregiving experiences. That's an enormous evolutionary gamble. It means every single human being alive today arrived into the world as a genuinely unfinished nervous system, betting everything on the presence of reliable, attentive caregivers to complete the job. And this is where the deeper mechanism starts to reveal itself, because helplessness this extreme isn't just costly. It's expensive in almost every currency evolution cares about: time, energy, risk, and vulnerability. A helpless infant is a liability to its parents, a magnet for predators, and a massive metabolic drain for years before it can contribute anything back to the group. By almost any cold evolutionary logic, a species should not evolve toward more helplessness. It should evolve toward faster independence, the way a foal does, the way a sea turtle hatchling does, the way almost every prey species on the planet does. So the fact that humans evolved in the exact opposite direction, toward radically extended dependency, tells you that something about that dependency must have paid for itself, and paid for itself enormously. There's a cinematic way to picture this whole system in action, and it involves a scene that's played out roughly identically, with only minor variations, in every human culture across every continent for as long as our species has existed. A newborn, minutes old, is placed directly onto its mother's bare chest. The room, whether it's a modern hospital or a hut lit by firelight 10,000 years ago, goes quiet. The infant, unable to see clearly, unable to hold up its own head, unable to do almost anything except breathe and cry, instinctively turns toward the warmth and the heartbeat it's heard from the inside for 9 months. Within the first hour, if conditions allow it, the infant will attempt something remarkable given how helpless it otherwise is. A slow, uncoordinated crawl of only a few inches, guided almost entirely by smell, toward the mother's breast. Researchers call this the breast crawl, and it's one of the only pieces of complex motor behavior a newborn human can perform entirely unassisted. It's a strange contradiction sitting right at the center of human birth. An infant that can't lift its own head can still, somehow, navigate its way toward the single resource critical to its survival, guided by scent receptors that have been working since before birth. It's as if evolution, having stripped away nearly every other form of self-sufficiency, made absolutely sure to leave this one instinct intact, because without it, nothing else about the system works. The payoff appears to be the brain itself, or more specifically, the kind of brain that can only be built through an extended, protected, socially supported developmental window. A brain this complex, capable of language, abstract reasoning, long-term planning, and dense social cognition simply cannot finish forming inside a birth canal that's already at its structural limit. It has to finish forming outside, in a nest, surrounded by caregivers, over years, not weeks. Which means human helplessness at birth isn't the cost of human intelligence. It's the mechanism that makes human intelligence possible at all. You couldn't get one without the other. Every enormous leap in human cognitive capacity had to be paid for with an equally enormous leap in how long and how thoroughly that developing brain needed protection before it could function on its own. This is also where the story turns towards something closer to a villain, if this kind of story can be said to have one. And the villain isn't evolution itself. It's the mismatch between the caregiving system evolution actually built and the living arrangements a huge number of modern humans are now forced into. Cooperative breeding, the system Hurdy describes, assumes a baby will be raised inside a dense network. Multiple adults, multiple older children, grandparents living close by or in the same household. A community structurally available to absorb the enormous caregiving load a helpless infant demands. For the overwhelming majority of human history, that's roughly what child rearing looked like. Then, particularly across the last century in industrialized nations, that structure quietly collapsed for millions of families. Extended households fragmented into small nuclear units. Grandparents ended up living states or continents away. Neighborhoods stopped functioning as informal caregiving networks. What used to be a caregiving job shared across 6, 8, sometimes 10 people got compressed down to 1 or 2 exhausted adults, often isolated in an apartment or a house, with no built-in relief system anywhere nearby. The infant, meanwhile, is still running the exact same 2-million-year-old software. It still expects, on some deep biological level, the presence of multiple attentive caregivers. It has no idea that the social architecture it was designed to be born into has largely disappeared for a huge percentage of the people currently raising it. Some researchers studying postpartum mental health have pointed to exactly this mismatch, not simply as one contributing factor among many, but as a uniquely modern kind of environmental mismatch, when trying to explain why rates of parental burnout and postpartum depression appear so elevated in societies where extended family caregiving has largely disappeared. A system built for a village is now, for millions of people, being run by 1 or 2 people locked inside 4 walls, and the baby has absolutely no evolutionary awareness that anything about its situation is unusual. Here's the part that tends to land hardest once people actually sit with it. This isn't ancient history confined to some distant hunter-gatherer past. This exact evolutionary trade-off is still happening inside every single human birth today. Every contraction, every hour of labor, every moment of a newborn unable to lift its own head is the live, ongoing echo of a 2-million-year negotiation between the size of a skull and the width of a pelvis. A negotiation neither side ever definitively won. Modern medicine has changed the survival odds dramatically, but it hasn't changed the underlying architecture. Human babies are still born with unfinished brains, unfinished thermoregulation, unfinished immune systems, and an instinctive grasp reflex reaching for fur that hasn't existed on a human body for over 1 million years. There's one more piece of this puzzle that rarely makes it into the conversation, and it might be the strangest of all. Humans are one of only a small handful of species on the planet, alongside a couple of species of toothed whales, where females routinely live for decades after their reproductive years have ended. Menopause, in evolutionary terms, is genuinely bizarre. From a purely reproductive standpoint, an organism that can no longer produce offspring shouldn't, in theory, be kept alive by natural selection for another 30 or 40 years. Yet, human grandmothers do exactly that. And researchers studying this pattern, including anthropologist Kristen Hawkes, have proposed what's become known as the grandmother hypothesis. The idea that menopause evolved specifically because older, no longer fertile women who redirected their energy toward helping raise grandchildren dramatically improved those grandchildren's odds of survival. In populations Hawkes studied among modern hunter-gatherer groups, children with actively involved grandmothers showed measurably better survival and growth outcomes than children without that additional caregiver. Put plainly, a menopausal grandmother may have been, for a huge stretch of human evolutionary history, one of the single most valuable members of the caregiving network surrounding a helpless infant. This isn't a side detail. It's a direct continuation of the same story. The obstetric dilemma made babies helpless. Helpless babies required cooperative breeding. Cooperative breeding required a dependable pool of caregivers beyond just the mother. And that requirement was significant enough that it appears to have reshaped the human female lifespan itself, keeping grandmothers alive and useful decades past the point where their own bodies could produce another child. Somewhere underneath the entire architecture of human helplessness sits a genuinely startling idea. The reason human women can live to be 70, 80, 90 years old might, at least in part, trace back to a baby that couldn't hold up its own head. There's a particular moment that captures this whole idea better than any statistic could. A new mother, hours after delivery, is holding her newborn skin to skin, and the baby, eyes barely able to focus, reflexively curls its fingers around one of her fingers with surprising strength. That grip, that specific evolutionary leftover, is a fossil of a caregiving system that used to involve a mother's body hair and a baby that once needed to hold on for dear life while being carried through trees. The baby doesn't know any of that history. It's not attempting anything conscious. It's simply running an ancient piece of code written for a body that no longer exists in a species that replaced fur with something else entirely: other people. And that replacement might be the single most important detail in this entire story. Because when evolution took away the thing infants used to physically cling to, it didn't leave a gap. It filled that gap with an entire social system, with grandmothers, aunts, older children, chosen family, and communities structurally organized around the fact that human offspring cannot survive their own first years without an enormous, coordinated, multi-person effort. Every playground, every daycare, every extended family gathering, every informal network of parents trading childcare favors, all of it is, in a very real sense, downstream of a pelvis that stopped being able to widen roughly 2 million years ago. So the next time you see a newborn unable to hold up its own head, don't file it away as simple fragility. That helplessness is the price tag on the most complex brain that has ever existed on this planet, and the reason human beings, alone among nearly every species on Earth, had no choice but to become deeply, permanently, structurally dependent on each other. We didn't build societies because we're social by some vague accident of temperament. We built them because every single one of us arrived as an unfinished project. And unfinished projects, it turns out, are the reason we ever learned to need anyone at all.